Raúl Sanguinetti, let's talk about him. Born in Parana, Argentina, February 2nd, 1933. Passed away August 6th, 2000. International Master in 1957. Grandmaster 1982. That was a meritorious title, but well-deserved. 7-time Argentine chess champion. He was his country's champion in 56, 57, 62, 65, 69, 73, and 74. He did not really play in Europe, though, which may have been one of the reasons he didn't achieve the Grandmaster title earlier. He did play in Europe twice, at Portoros and at Biel, and those were both interzonals, 1958 and 1976, respectively. But he has played in great tournaments many times in South America. His best result was champion of South America at Fortaleza, which was a zonal tournament, 1975. He also had first place at Buenos Aires, 1977. No losses in that event. All right, we're going to get another Fry Lopez, another Morphy's defense, another Columbus variation. Knight f6, castles, bishop e7, another closed Spanish. Same opening that we saw earlier. d6, c3, castles, h3. Paul Quedes, d4? No. D4, the so-called Yates variation, named for, what was Yates's first name? It's right on the tip of my brain. Anyway, he's from England, Yates. This line continues with bishop g4, which is why a lot of people prefer Paul Quedes' variation. And we continue with bishop e3, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, and then knight a5 hits the bishop and comes to c2. c5, and then we're going to play h3 here. Bishop h5 and g4 and bishop g6. Now we'll bring our queen's knight to d2, and our opponent typically here plays knight d7. So that's the Bogolyubov variation in the Yates line, the d4 line that Shark 101194 likes. I went back too far. I should mention the Bogolyubov variation is this move here. This move is Yates variation. That's Bogolyubov. But h3 here avoids this whole idea. Knight a5, bishop c2, pawn c5, and here d4 is played. And we get, again, Mikhail Chigorin's defense. Queen's knight d2, rook e8, knight f1. Bishop f8, and the idea is to reposition the bishop. Now, for some reason, that gets an inaccuracy, but it's the most commonly played move. We've seen it a lot of times. Bishop g5, knight d7, knight e3, knight b6, rook c1. Yeah, b3 is more frequent. The point of b3 is it prevents both of these knights. He's got two knights that can move to c4, but b3 stops either of them from moving to c4. Bobby chooses rook c1 in this game. f6, the better way to attack the bishop is h6, keeping this diagonal to the king closed. Generally, it's not a good idea to open lines of attack towards your king. After h6, white would have to play bishop h4, and then you could develop your queen's bishop. Coming back, f6 was played. Bishop h4 anyway, bishop e6, knight d5. Well, that is questioned by the bot wanting pawn d5 to hit the bishop, but really, notice that the bot is also favoring, for black, the knight a to c4. So b3 is always going to be a move in this position. Let's see what we get. A star. Knight d5 was played. Queen b7, right? I was kind of expecting bishop takes knight. You could also play knight takes knight, depending on your preference. Bishop takes knight, and we're going to take this with the pawn. Queen f7. Or you can take with the knight if you prefer. Just as good. It's the same thing. It's just different. Note that in either of these lines, you don't want to take this pawn and move your piece in line with my queen. So he'd have to retreat to f7 here, for example. Taking this pawn begs for a discovered attack, right? And even so, you could trade the bishop off for this knight with tempo and then take the pawn. My pieces are now more active than yours are. I've got the bishop pair. You've got a backward pawn on an open file. And notice the eval bar definitely favors white. And I'm even thinking about getting my bishop here, improve my bishop with tempo. But we're going to do that, and then we're going to attack the backward pawn with a rook, right? Hit this, make a move as rook, something like so. Oh, yeah, there's always this. You always want to consider whether or not to keep this knight out, because the knight is now going to be enveloped, kind of out of play. All right, let's go back. None of that was played. Instead, queen b7. b4 hits the knight. Knight takes knight does feel stronger, doesn't it? And after the queen takes the knight, I'm going to hit your bishop and force it back to d7. But b4 it is in this game. Knight to c4. Knight takes knight now. Queen takes knight. Bishop b3, lining up with the king. B takes c5 should probably also be considered. It comes with a hit on the queen, so it's forcing. Yep, and get a star. And again, after pawn takes the pawn, I'm not going to capture. I'm going to push the pawn with tempo, and I've made a passed pawn. Come back. Bishop b3 was played. C takes d4. C takes d4. Pawn a5. Bot calling for king's rook to c8. Pawn takes d4 was my choice. I get a thumbs up. After pawn takes c4, white has to play queen takes pawn, queen takes queen, knight takes queen, and then the bishop will have to move, presumably to f7. a5 was played by Sanguineti. B takes a5, knight takes a5, bishop takes the bishop check, rook takes the bishop, queen d3, rook e back to e8, rook b1, super attacking the b-man. He decided to move it to a square that was only once attacked. That's called inaccurate here. I was expecting rook e b8 to add support to the pawn. Rook e2 here. And you've got other options. That gets a star. But you can also get your bishop in a better place, get your rook on the open file. Let's see what those two moves get. That gets an inaccuracy, and then that is called for. What about this? That also is not the best. It's a doll hair from Space Slim, kicking in another buckaroo. Thank you, Space Slim. Every doll hair counts. All right, anyway, these are feasible moves nonetheless. Rook e2 does get the nod. Rook e b8 now is played. Ironically, grabbing the open file himself is said by the bot to be the better choice. We double our rooks on the b file. Queen b5, putting the question to our queen, and that question is answered with a trade. Queen d1 does seem a bit more appropriate. And that gives queen access eventually, not right away because of the knight. But the idea is at some point, queen b3. It's looming, let's put it that way. If I play queen d1, black is probably going to play rook a7. I'll get my rook to the c file. Well, this is probably equal. I was going to play here. If you play rook takes pawn, right, you get this. And you get two rooks against a queen, which would be very interesting. Anyway, queen takes queen was played. Rook takes queen, pawn d5, queen's rook to b8. I see. Yeah, knight b7 is a good move. It discovers control of these squares. Look, the idea here is this is a subtle way to prevent this pawn from pushing. Instead, rook a b8 was played. Knight d2, king f7. Yeah, okay. I mean, we're approaching the end game. This move is very... I wouldn't give it an inaccuracy. I would think it's worth at least a check mark. f3 here, g6, bishop e1, bishop h6, pawn a4 here, right? King f2, and get your own king into the game. Now bishop e3 check. King f1 here. Interposing is more active because your bishop's under attack. You got to do something about it. You can trade bishops and the king ends up on f2. You could trade bishop for knight, which is not as good. You don't want to trade bishop for knight. Bobby with king f1. Rook 5 b7, knight b3. Now don't play bishop f2 here, I don't think, right? Bishop takes knight now, and now he can play b3. Or knight c4. As you can see, black has an edge here. So don't play bishop f2 here. King e2 might be interesting. He gets a check mark. I'm going to mark it with interesting. Because I'm attacking the bishop. His best bet is probably to just come up here to c5 and kind of knot everything up. But now I can improve my king even more. Well, knight b3 here from Fischer puts a question to his counterpart. And I was fully expecting knight takes knight, forcing rook takes knight. The point here is this knight controls the c5 square. So I was a bit surprised by knight c4. On knight takes knight, rook takes knight, now bishop c5. And again, you've got everything kind of locked up. So knight c4 was played, hitting the rook. Rook a2, rook a8, king e2, knight a3. It's marked inaccurate. This can't be bad. I don't think that's inaccurate. He lifts his rook to b2, bishop g1, pawn a5, rook a7, now rook a1. A lot of dancing around. Time controls are definitely an issue here. Bishop c5 here, rook c1, rook c7, bishop d2. Don't take the bishop here. On bishop takes, rook takes, and then I have to play king d1 probably, and he's going to play knight c4. Bishop d2 was played. Knight b5. He doubles his rooks. Yeah, I guess that's a better move. It kind of is a preparatory move for the same idea, but you can still move your rook over this way if you need to, and then your king's defending the other rook. Rook bc2 was played. Knight a3 hits the rook. Comes with a tempo, so again, I don't care that the bot calls it inaccurate. Rook b2, knight b5, and we're seeing the players make some non-moves to increment the move counter to satisfy the time control. King d3, knight a3. His knight just going back and forth, isn't it? Now knight takes the bishop. And I also had this idea here. These pieces really are in fairly good places. You might want to push your pawns, right? Like h4, g4, f4. Let's take a look at each of these. I get a check mark there. I get a star there. And I get a check mark there. But Bobby goes for a direct. And time, again, it's a matter of time. If you had time to calculate that out, that's another matter. D takes c5, bishop e3, c4 check, moving to the defense of the knight and rook. I was expecting rook takes pawn here, actually. Now, the point here is that this pawn is pinned. So that means this pawn is safe to capture, right? But then you can still play c4 here with check and push my king back. Maybe rook b5, etc. Come back. c4 here, check. King e2, pawn b3, bishop b6. Don't take the rook. Do not take the rook. These pawns are too strong. So he could try d6 here, perhaps. Yeah, I get a star. Move the rook over. And then I guess I could take the rook because now my pawns are becoming strong. And I'm going to get behind that pawn because rooks belong behind passed pawns. So one square does make a difference, doesn't it? Anyway, Bobby playing bishop b6. What a move. So clever. This pawn, of course, more valuable than the average pawn. Rook c b7, still hoping for bishop takes. Rook a1. Yeah, the thing about king d2, the point is these pawns are also extremely valuable. And these two pawns together are worth at least this knight and almost worth a rook. And so creating a blockade here is Pretty important. Bobby with rook a1. Knight c2 hits the rook. And again, I don't know why it gets a big red X. This pawn becomes pinned, just like the other pawn in the other scenario going the other way. So now the threat is rook takes the bishop. Of course, if you play the move suggested, it's still the same thing. That pawn is still pinned. So this threat against our bishop is still real. And I'm sure that would compel us to go ahead and take that rook at the end of the day, because the bishop's now undefended because the pawn is pinned to the rook. All right, so it accomplishes the same thing, but this hits the rook. So rook c1, knight a3, rook a1. And again, they're incrementing the move counter because their clocks are ticking. When you see these repetitions by grandmasters, you'll note that it's always right in the vicinity, or almost always in the vicinity, of a time control. So knight c2 doesn't come as a surprise. And here Bobby plays rook takes c2. I don't know about that. It gets a big red X. The bot calling for rook g1. You can still move this rook, but just don't put it on c1. You can avoid the repetition, for example, with rook d1. Bobby deciding to go ahead and take the knight, and pawn takes. But that time is ticking. Yeah, coming back to what I was saying a moment ago. The pawn is pinned. This has been in our sights, and this surely was the time to play it. So you can't take that rook. You have to take this pawn. Obviously, if you take the rook, you're doomed. Say, why am I doomed? I've got a pawn that's about to promote. Well, you can't push the pawn without losing your rook, and then he promotes too, and he's up a full rook. And if you blockade his pawn, here comes the other pawn. And as you know, two abreast on the sixth are unstoppable by a rook. Take this, and I'm pushing on, and the promotion square is defended because the king neglected to get to d2. Otherwise, you could get behind this pawn, right? But in this case, it doesn't work. On the other hand, if you say, well, I'll make a queen after you do, you're too late because of the connection of these guys and the exposure of your king. You can make the queen, but there's check, and the only legal move is king e3. Uh-oh. All of these controlled, these two occupied. Wow. Checkmate right there. All right, back. For that reason, in this position, you'd have to take this pawn. And after b2, rook b1. And that is a dead equal eval bar. He's going to pick up your A-man. Okay, let's come back. Surprisingly, rook takes bishop was not played. Instead, pawn takes the rook on c2, rook c1. Now be careful not to grab this. That would be a blunder because of a very well-known technique, interference, and you can't take the rook without allowing the promotion. On the other hand, there's no way to stop the pawn from promoting here. So instead, rook c1. Rook a8, rook takes the pawn on c2, rook c8, king d2, king e7, king c3, king d7, rook b8, connect your rooks. King b4 here, now rook b8, rook takes the pawn, rook takes the rook check, king takes the rook. Black has a rook, but white has a bishop and two pawns, and they're passed pawns, making them at least worth 2 points each. Rook c8 check, bishop c5 blocks, rook b8, pawn a6, rook b2, trying to get behind the passed pawn, but as you can see from the eval bar, white is clearly winning. a7, rook a2, king b5, coming in to help, king c7, trying to keep the king at bay. The rook controls here. The black king controls these. Our king can make no progress unless we can get his king to move. And we do that with d6 check. King b7 continues to try to hold off our king, but now pawn d7 threatens to promote. Now the king covers a8, so black tries rook d2. So the king and the rook each covering a separate passed pawn. Bobby goes ahead and decoys the king further away, and that's a resignation. And the whole point here is the king is overworked. It cannot keep our king at bay and capture the queen both. So, for example, if king takes queen, this square is now available to our king. And it's important. You really need to know this technique. How do I make this pawn good? Well, first I defend it from the rook's capture, which was the point of sacrificing this one. You decoy the king away so that your king can access the c6 square. And now bishop d6 comes next, blocking the rook, interfering, and then there's nothing to stop the promotion, right? So, for example, let's do a nothing move. I'm going to play this, and nothing now stops the promotion. You can throw in a couple of spite checks, but I'm going to hide on the E file. And now there's nothing that can prevent. Oh, yeah, might as well take a pawn. But don't miss the point. The point is the bishop interferes with the rook's defense of the promotion square. For that reason, back here, he has to take the pawn now. And then from here, it's easy pickings, because I'm just going to come in and start picking off all of your guys. I'm up a full bishop. For that reason, after A8, Raúl Sanguinetti resigned the game. Bobby, with an accuracy of 90.6 and a single game rating of 2650.